Okay, welcome everyone to the EPG Pathshala. Today the course that we are doing is the course on mental health, and the particular module that I will be covering is the module entitled Mental Health and Custodial Settings. I am Dr. Penelope Tong, faculty with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Now what we will be covering today, I will be talking about mental health as a general issue of concern and why it is becoming an increasing source of concern both nationally and internationally. We will cover a little bit about what is mental health, what is mental illness, and then we will go into the question of what is an institution, what is a custodial institution, and why we are specifically discussing mental health in custodial settings today. And I will end with basically what are the current trends and movements towards addressing mental health situations within custodial settings. Okay. I will start with, as I said, why is mental health a source of concern? Okay. Now mental health has been found, mental health conditions have been found to be contributing substantially to the overall disease burden that health systems are facing globally. Okay, so it's all over the world that this is becoming a concern. Because mental health conditions are debilitating in nature and a person is not able to function normally, this is also an obstacle in the course of development. Now, mental health is something that affects persons of all age groups, so right from children to the elderly, and we have found that almost 10% of the world suffer with some form of a mental disorder. Now, as you would all know, having a mental disorder or being diagnosed with a mental disorder in itself is a source of stigma and could lead to exclusion. For this reason, people do not acknowledge the existence of any kind of situation that is pointing towards a mental health condition, and for this reason it also goes untreated, which means that the condition worsens. We have also found that there is an increasing number of cases of persons with mental illness. Now, within this whole scenario, the services that are available to address mental health conditions are inadequate because there is not enough of a budgetary allocation, and so it continues to be a problem that is growing in its seriousness. Okay. So, in terms of its contemporary relevance, it's something that has serious implications both nationally and internationally. So, this is a global situation that we are talking about. Now, what is mental health? Okay, I'm going to talk about what is mental health versus what is mental illness. Now, the World Health Organization in 2001 has provided us with a definition of mental health, where it says that mental health is a state of well-being that the human being undergoes, wherein a person is able to realize their abilities, their potentials, so to fulfill what they are capable of, to be able to deal with the normal stresses of life that we face. So the regular stresses may be a disappointment, loss of job, loss of maybe a family member. So these are the normal stresses. Work productively and fruitfully and be able to contribute to one's community. So if these four conditions are met, the person is considered to be in a state of mental health and well-being. Conversely, mental illness. What is mental illness? The American Psychiatric Association has defined mental illness as a health condition that changes the thinking, the feeling, and the behavior of a person. So it could be either one of these, or it could be all three. Now, when this happens, this causes distress to the person who is suffering and difficulty in participating in social, family, work situations. So when these conditions exist, then that could points to the fact that there is mental illness. Okay. Now in this whole situation of mental health and mental illness, we also need to address the question of vulnerability to mental illness. So who is vulnerable to mental illness? Technically, all of us are vulnerable to mental illness. Anybody can get mental illness. It's not that anybody is immune to mental illness. However, there are certain populations or certain groups that may be more vulnerable to mental illness because of the social circumstances that they are in. So I would like to stress that social circumstances, and particularly difficult social circumstances, make a person vulnerable to mental illness. Now among these populations, we see populations of persons who are homeless, maybe unemployed, maybe persons who are subjected to violence, abuse, neglect, and any difficult circumstance that might exist over a prolonged period of time. Okay. Now among all these, the persons who are in custodial institutions are also susceptible to disturbed mental health. Okay. That is the topic that we are covering today. So I will focus today on persons within custodial institutions and how that particular circumstance of their lives affects them. Now what is a custodial setting or an institution? Now by definition or by description, a custodial setting or an institution is a structure that basically is residential in nature and has a particular purpose. Okay. It's a physical structure. Now this structure houses largely people that form part of a homogeneous population. So you might have girls, you might have boys, you might have youth, you might have the elderly, you might have people from a particular common background or situation, so persons with particular kinds of illnesses, persons who might be in particular situations. So there's a common purpose, there are homogeneous populations. People within these custodial institutions do not have access to the rest of the world. And finally, the purposes of these custodial institutions might vary, right from treatment, shelter, protection, care, to confinement, containment, so there's a purpose for a custodial institution. Okay. Now when we are speaking about custodial institutions, a sociologist who has contributed significantly in this area is somebody called Irving Goffman. Okay. So right back 60 years ago in 1957, Goffman introduced a concept, he coined a term called total institution. And based on his observations, he identified characteristics of total institutions. Now he had spoken about 5 types of total institutions with 5 varying kind of objectives of these institutions. So on one hand, a total institution could be for somebody who is basically harmless to the rest of the population but in need of care and protection. So there might be institutions for children, for orphaned children, for women who have been victimized in some way, for the elderly. So the institution is basically to care for them and to protect them. There are other institutions where for health reasons the people in those institutions might be confined over there because their health condition can be a risk to the rest of the community. So for instance, tuberculosis, that was rampant in that time, and the way that health conditions were dealt with, especially when they were contagious. So that was another reason. There are also institutions which house people because they are a risk to the rest or put the rest of the society at risk or danger, so an example of those kind of institutions would be prison. Okay, prison and correctional institutions. Additionally, There are institutions which Goffman has spoken about where people come together for a common purpose. Okay, so there are boarding schools, military camps, army camps, so people are living together in an institutional setting where they don't have access to the rest of the world at that particular point of time, but they are there for a purpose. And finally, the fifth institution that Goffman mentioned was for religious purposes. So convents, monasteries, where people live together, isolated from the rest of the world, but for purposes of religion and spirituality. Now, Goffman has also spoken about the characteristics of these institutions, and one thing, so I will just outline those. So he found that these total institutions were characterized often by high walls, locked doors, barbed wire, so very restrictive and restraining physical structures. Now these structures, within these structures, life took place within an enclosed space. So there was a restricted enclosed space, life was formally administered. So how you lived your life in these institutions was decided by the people who ran the institutions. So there was a clear delineation between the custodians, so who were the administrative staff, so they were the custodians, and the others were the custodialized. So there was no close relationship between them, there was a very formal relationship. There's also a predetermined schedule, so life takes place as per a routine, and obedience and compliance are required and demanded within these custodial institutions. And finally, the whole process of exit and entry is not voluntary. So as we will see later, sometimes entry just might be in very rare situations, but otherwise entry is also forced and exit is also determined externally, so by the custodians or by an external body. So these were institutions that Goffman spoke about. Now we will go to the process of institutionalization. So I will repeat about what is the purpose of custodialization and how is this custodialization affected. Okay. So when we are talking about the purpose, I have already said the purpose could range from a person being confined in a custodial institution for the purpose of treatment, care, protection, and on the other hand even containment and maybe even punishment. Okay. So these are the broad reasons why institutions and institutionalization happened. How institutionalization happened also varies. So as I said, in some situations there might be voluntary action. So for instance, an elderly person might feel that I do not have anybody to care for me and I will choose to admit myself into an institution. So once the person is in an institution, then the rest of the rules and procedures of a total institution might apply, but for that point of time it is through voluntary action. Additionally, it might also be something that is warranted on the behest of a caretaker. So if a child is being taken care of by a relative, there are no family members, there are no parents, at that point of time if the caretaker feels that I am not able to care for this child or I don't want to care for this child, at that time they might apply to an institution and so warrant the institutionalization. Institutionalization also happens by virtue of rescue. So somebody might be rescued from a situation and then kept in an institution. So that is then by the order of a court or a commitment order. And finally through arrest. These are how, what is the purpose of an institutionalizing somebody and how this institutionalization gets effected. Now within India, we have certain laws, we have certain kinds of custodial institutions. So I would like to outline for you today 6 social legislations by virtue of which institutionalization happens. I'd also like to say over here that within the context of these 6 legislations that I'm going to speak about today, institutionalization might take on a different connotation. So custody and institution in itself might mean different things. Okay? So we have, right back in 1956, we have the Women's and Children's Institutions Licensing Act. At that time, under this act, the institutions for the care and protection of children and women were set up, and women and children were kept in these institutions. These institutions were either reception centers which received people, who were in situations of distress, or they were longer term shelters. Okay? There is also the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act, once again of 1956, and under this act, persons in situations of sexual exploitation, institutions for them were set up. So there are two types of institutions that have been set up under the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act. One is called a corrective institution, where persons who might be accused or charged for an offense under this act were kept for the purpose of correction. Okay? And the second is a protective home, whereby persons who were victimized under this act were kept in order to be protected. We also have the Bombay Prevention of Beggary Act of 1959, where persons who were found begging were there. So once again, under this act, there are reception centers where persons who have been found begging are picked up, apprehended, and brought to these reception centers for a temporary period. So reception centers were largely more temporary in nature. And then you have certified institutions where people were kept there for a longer time, where there was training, employment, and sometimes maybe even families were permitted to live along with the person. So these were certified institutions. Then we have the Juvenile Justice Act, more recently amended, of course, in 2015. Under this act, there are three types of institutions and custody that is mentioned. So one are the children's homes, so for children in need of care and protection. One are special homes, so that is for children who are in conflict with the law, so who have been accused of some kind of crime. And then you have the child care institutions, which cover both children's homes, special homes, and other kinds of children's institutions. So it is, it covers a wider range. We also have the Mental Health Act of 1987, and right now, there's a current bill of the Mental Health Care Bill. Now, under the Mental Health Act of 1957, reference was made to two institutions. So one is a psychiatric hospital, and the second is a psychiatric nursing home, both for the purposes of confinement but with treatment as the objective. Okay? And finally, we have the Criminal Procedure Code of 1973, whereby the code permits custody of persons who have been charged for some kind of an offense. So under as per the Criminal Procedure Code, the custody is three types. So there is police custody, so that is soon after the arrest for the purpose of investigation and interrogation. There is judicial custody, where the person is under the custody of the court, where the person is awaiting their trial, so until the completion of the trial and determination of either innocence or guilt. And the third is prison custody, which is once the person has been convicted and sentenced, and that is the time the person is in the custody of the prison department. Okay? Now, when we are looking at the whole idea of institutionalization, what one can see is that institutionalization in itself is a response by the society and community and the state to a social problem, to the fallout of a social problem. So a social problem is the underlying basis. Due to a social problem, certain other problems exist, so crime may be one of them, vulnerability may be one of them, and for that purpose, institutions were set up in order to respond to the fallouts of social problems. So that is one reason. for institutionalization. And secondly, one also has to recognize that when we are talking about institutionalization, persons who are coming into institutions are already have already undergone difficult life circumstances. So institutionalized populations may already be vulnerable to that extent. And what happens when a person comes to an institution? The risk of developing mental health disturbance increases, for this reason. As I said, it's already a fallout of so it's a response, and it's a harsh response. The person has already undergone a difficult life situation, and then the custodialization in itself could put the person at a further risk. Now, what is it about institutionalization that actually causes disturbed mental health? Okay, I'd like to highlight 3 points over here. One is that custodial conditions in themselves could cause disturbed mental health. Now, what are these custodial conditions? So, there is firstly confinement. You are in a particular space where you cannot move out of this particular area. There is often overcrowding, so many people living in that particular space. There might be violence, so because of persons feeling agitated, frustrated, so the violence might be among inmates as well as for purposes of discipline. There is isolation, there is forced separation from the rest of the society, there might be sex segregation, there might be and there's an imposed schedule. So for all these reasons, as you might be able to understand, these could cause a person to become vulnerable to disturbed mental health. Okay. Additionally, as I said, already people have been in situations that are have been socially challenging, and so there is already a predisposition. So some situations of mental health, people might come in already with different mental health conditions, which then might get aggravated within the custodial institution. When one looks at what contributes to overall good mental health in the general population, it has been found that there are 3 things that are of significant importance. One is social integration, conducive living conditions is the second, and the third is opportunities for recreation. Now, out of all these, social integration has been found to be critical, and being in an institution actually counters scope for social integration. So you are actually not integrated with the rest of the society, you are separated, you are alienated, you are isolated from the rest of the society, and that becomes an important risk factor for developing disturbed mental health. Now, when we look at what is happening, what are the current efforts to counter this situation of the effects of institutionalization on mental health in custodial settings. Okay. So there are 3 things that one can clearly see as happening. One is, we know that there are a lot of children's institutions, so where children who are orphaned, in need of care and protection, that are institutionalized, some from the time of birth and some at a later stage of their lives. Currently, we are making efforts to move, within India as well, but more internationally, and we in India are still, to move in that direction, moving children out of institutions into foster care. So where children get an opportunity to live within the family, within the community, and within a situation that's possibly more natural. Okay. When it comes to mental health, which is another area where institutionalization within a custodial setting takes place, there are efforts, increasing efforts to move towards community-based alternatives. Okay. So how can somebody with a mental health condition live within the community and continue to be supported, treated, and move out of that particular condition? And thirdly, when we are talking about prison, which is, you know, another custodial institution that one is, you know, commonly aware of. There also one is making an effort to move towards community service. So at least persons who are in for, you know, more petty offences, lower level offences, have the option of moving towards community service. Once again, this is still to take root, you know, in a significant way in India, but in many parts of the world it is already being practiced. However, institutions and institutionalization continues to happen, possibly because of a lack of alternatives. So if there aren't any alternatives, or the community is still not willing to look at those alternatives, then institutionalization continues to be an option. Okay. Now I'll just go to something that the World Health Organization has identified and formulated as a plan. So there is a plan whereby they are between 2013 and 2020 are making efforts to actually increase the budgetary allocation for mental health services. They are also making targeting increased mental health services, so increased availability of mental health services, availability of medication, sufficiency of mental health professionals, so persons who are trained to deal with mental health, and also looking at overall care and protection for persons with mental illness. Okay. When you look at the new trends, you know, we have come a long way when it comes to our understanding of mental health, our response to mental health, and currently there is an increased understanding that persons who are suffering with mental health conditions and their families need to participate more in decision making regarding their treatment and, you know, the way they are integrated in society. So this is also being seen as one possible solution for addressing mental health. Additionally, we are also recognizing that mental health is not, disturbed mental health is not something that happens in isolation. It is very linked to the social situations and the social contexts of our society. So we need to see it as part of the overall social processes. And if we have to address these processes, we need to address processes such as inequality, marginalization, exclusion, social injustice, because addressing those kind of situations could affect overall mental health and even the need for institutionalization. It could counter the need for institutionalization and it could foster an increased amount of integration in community. And finally, of course, we look at, we need to focus on overall promotion of mental health, prevention of mental disorders, and treatment, care and support to those who are already suffering. Okay. With that, I have covered the module mental health and custodial settings. What I have covered is we have looked at why is mental health of concern, of increasing concern today. We've looked at what is mental health, what is mental illness, what are custodial settings and institutions, what characterize these institutions, why do these institutions pose a risk, or why does residence in these institutions pose a risk to disturbed mental health. And finally, we have looked at how we are now moving towards improved mental health by addressing, you know, the effects of institutionalization, and I have ended with situating disturbed mental health within the larger context of our society. Of course, the module has only covered points, you know, largely we have outlined what is the situation with mental health and custodial settings, but I would ask you to go back to the e-module, read the content. There are references over there which you can refer to, which will help you understand this module in greater detail. I hope that you have been able to understand the main issues that I have tried to raise. Thank you.